Fantasy-animation.org is a completely free online educational resource dedicated to examining the relationship between fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Our weekly blog posts are written by professional animators and academics and explore a range of diverse topics from the sexual identity of SpongeBob SquarePants to the practical reality of how to make an animation documentary on a pair of knickers. If you like our blogs and podcasts and would like us to make more of them, please do consider supporting the project by simply subscribing to the show via your regular podcast subscription service. And, if available, give us a quick star rating or, better yet, a written review. This really helps to improve our visibility on such sites and help us to grow our organisation and our listeners. Recommend the website to your friends, family and colleagues by all means, and please follow us at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Reddit. I hope you enjoy the show.
Everybody get up, it's time to slam now. We got the real jam going down. Welcome to the Space Jam. Here's your chance, do your dance at the Space Jam. Alright.
Hello everybody and welcome to this special sports-themed episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent, and this episode I'm trying to decide whether I'm Bugs Bunny and you're Michael Jordan, or whether the other way around. I've been thinking about it for a while and I've resigned myself to the fact that I'm the animated one this week.
Interesting. Okay, well, I say sports-themed, as you've gestured to, because in this instalment we're taking on Space Jam, the 1996 part animated, part Michael Jordan sports comedy that probably did for basketball what the Mighty Ducks did for ice hockey, maybe, perhaps. Now, for me, there's obviously lots to say with regards to hybridity, something we've obviously touched on a lot in this podcast, animation's relationship to sport, and of course, many callbacks that the film makes to the golden age of Hollywood cartooning. Alex, are celebrated US cartoon characters playing basketball with NBA sports stars and Bill Murray in any way fantasy?
No, this is the first one we've done that isn't. No, of course it is. It made me think a lot about registers of fantasy. I think it reminded me a lot of the episode we did on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and we can talk about different sort of rhetorics and registers and worlds within worlds and worlds that are worlds and extensions to our own worlds and what's animated and what's live action and all that. And also, this is a film that I sort of devoured as a child, so I've got probably quite a lot to say about nostalgia, both so for a film and in a film, because I think in many ways the film is nostalgic for an age it is not. As well as biography. I'm going to make the case that in a way you can see this as a kind of biopic for Michael Jordan. I won't make it strongly, but I'll make it a little bit and rambunctiously throughout.
Sure, of course, I expect nothing less. And apologies for I said to you off air, apologies for the sports puns that are about to happen, but joining us on the Toon Squad is our own MVP, Professor Paul Wells. I've done it, who is director, and we're thrilled, he's director of the Animation Academy at Loughborough University, as well as being an internationally established scholar, screenwriter, director, and he's worked across both academia and industry context. He's published across sort of animation and film studies, and I think Alex and I are particularly delighted to welcome Paul Wells as our guest, not least for those reasons, but because he's very much part of the fantasy animation story. He was not only one of our keynote speakers at the Fantasy Animation Conference where this all began in 2015, but also kindly wrote the first chapter of the subsequent collection. So we're really thrilled to have Paul chat with us today. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, no, it's fantastic to join you both. Chris and Alex, I enjoy the podcast. Very, very pleased to be part of this conversation. I'm sure we're going to cover a lot of interesting ground.
Well, that's the thing. I think this film, and I was saying to you just before we started, it's sort of tricky to pick a film that perhaps speaks to your research, given that you've researched and written on so much. But we sort of felt, I think, that Space Jam as a potential case study sort of did things and interacted with a number of your research interests. So I guess to kick things off, we were wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of expounding a bit on the film, perhaps reflect on what there is in the film for us as animation folks. What makes Space Jam so interesting for a podcast like this?
Well, it's interesting because it's a film that was made in 1996 or something like that. So it feels like a million years old. It feels like a million years old in my life as well, in the sense that it was kind of quite an interesting touchstone at the time. Sport in my life had always been downtime. It'd always been downtime. My son later on was a very good footballer. My daughter, a very good swimmer. But for me, I was kind of like a big Chelsea fan. Sorry to mention that, but Lord knows.
Oh, it's been a lovely episode. Bye, everyone. That's.
You're suffering now. Goodbye, everybody. But and I love the NFL, and I go to the American games here, and I love the cricket and all the rest of it. So sport was always my downtime, and I religiously kept it separate, really, from animation. Animation was my kind of work thing, and sport was my downtime. But increasingly, I saw the relationship really between the two of them, and the close relationship. And sort of sport, once we got to Space Jam, they obviously directed and completely interacted in ways that kind of forced my hand on that, really. And I loved Jordan at the time. I followed the Bulls, and it was great. Peak period for Jordan. I'd seen these original advertisements initially with Jordan and the kind of the Warner Brothers cartoon characters. It was a film waiting to happen, as it were, and ultimately, of course, Space Jam arrives, and technically at the time, of course, it was quite a revelation. It had used the kind of 2.5D software for some of the first times anyway. All the kind of shots with Jordan were shot in a big green screen kind of stadia, so he could play freely in terms of the kind of skills and so forth that he'd had. Film included Charles Barkley, who was kind of like played out as a bit of slightly a villain in the film. He's obviously one of the Monstars' talents, but also he was the anti-Jordan. He was the guy that turned around and told the public that he didn't want to be a role model. I'm not bringing up your kids. He said, I'm a basketball player. Whereas Jordan obviously was always a kind of I want to be a the kind of all-American male who you follow religiously as a sports icon. So lots going on there. But what really fascinated me ultimately from an animation point of view was the fact that, okay, you can combine Warner Brothers cartoon characters and the cartoonal, but you were actually combining it with Michael Jordan, who at this time, of course, had established the Air Jordan brand and the whole idea of flight, the whole kind of thing about that somehow Jordan could fly. And I just thought, well, this is really interesting because ultimately on the court, this great leap and range that he had, this extraordinary athleticism. But I just thought, well, what's the film going to do with that? Because anything he can do, any animated character can do better. They can stretch, they can slide, they can leap far better than he can. And I kept thinking, wow, this is going to be the kind of thing in the film that I'm looking out for. And, it's not a spoiler, some 24 or 25 years on, whatever it is, to say when we get the final sequence when Jordan actually does the big leap towards the basket from the middle of the court, he kind of like stretches and then the big flight thing takes place. And then somehow his arm extends another 20 miles to put the ball in the basket. And I thought, there it is, in order for Jordan to be even uber Jordan, to be mega Jordan, he's got to be animated, And so it was a great kind of sort of relationship between those things for me that started a real interest after that between animation and sport. Not an easy one, especially over my career, because it's taken a long time for animation itself to be of interest to anybody. But if it's about sport, there's a very close relationship between them, because they are both acts of deliberate choreography in terms of a sequence of action, and ultimately that very starting premise for me enabled me to bring them together.
Well, I guess I knowing what I know of your work and the connections that you've made between sport and animation, this seemed... of course, it seemed like an obvious choice, but actually, I hadn't, because I'd not seen the film before, and I was struck, and maybe this is where Alex jumps in with his, this is really a biopic about Michael Jordan, how much he sort of drives the way that his body is created in a way that suggests he is animated and certainly is subject to certain kinds of cartoonal physics and laws throughout the film and so forth. But what really struck me was the grounding that the film makes in establishing him as a star, and I think there's lots to say about his relationship to Bugs Bunny in terms of stardom. But yeah, I mean, you have the first star is Bugs Bunny entering the Warner Brothers logo as he traditionally did, 60 years ago, and then you have quite an elongated sequence of Michael Jordan-ness. You have after the sort of child sequence where he sort of grows up. I think it's summer 1973. You have a flashback to Michael as a child, and then suddenly you have quite an elongated over the credit sequence of a couple of minutes footage and shots of his performance and his action. And there's something about the film, what the film tries to do in recuperating that into the world of animation immediately. He is a highly animated and, as you said, an uber Jordan in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting, all of that, because of course this does come at the time where the footage from the conference, there is real footage of his retirement conference, and kind of like, and he did go on to play baseball, and he played, semi successfully. I mean, they play him out in the film, ironically, as a bit of a failure in baseball, but he did have some success, but of course never the success he had as, I mean, the greatest superstar in basketball that he still is, really. I mean, I know we've got the sequel coming up of Space Jam: The Legacy with LeBron James, of course, and that will be an interesting comparison. But Jordan really is still the kind of, I suppose Kobe Bryant might be considered there as well, but Jordan really is considered the icon of basketball. And that sequence that kind of, the whole film really is a wonderful bridging agent for him to come back to his return to the Chicago Bulls after that, of course, later on. So it kind of keeps him as this kind of, star figure, whilst telling his story and enabling him to play the star element in it. I mean, what's really, I think, interesting about that is the end of the film, where really, some very superstar players in their own right, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing particularly, who have been the Monstars, their talent's been stolen to play for the Monstars. Those are seriously, seriously good players in NBA history. And both of them, along with the other players, kind of, just play to Jordan as if he's the boy. He's given them back their talent, he's given them back their lives, he's given them back their livelihoods, by saving, the NBA, which ironically, which really chimes with now, has actually said we're going to play no more basketball because this is a virus. This is something which has stopped us from playing basketball, and we're not going to play again until basically someone has cured this virus. So ultimately, Jordan in this game comes back with their talent from winning the basketball game, but ultimately he's giving back these major players who actually defer to him, their ability. So it's an extraordinary story, and it does really enhance Michael Jordan's kind of iconic star figure, really.
And the meta narrative surrounding that, Paul, of course, is that that he does come back to the NBA, and the sort of what Space Jam does is kind of narrativize fantastically, in the sort of literal rather than sort of superlative sense of the words, how he comes about that decision to return to the NBA at a point where Jordan is sort of the global superstar that embodies what the NBA can be, is the excitement of the NBA. To add fantasy to the equation, he's a fantastical star that seems to embody the NBA itself, right? And so in many ways that finale is a thank you for coming back and sort of re-energizing the NBA with this sort of cultural, imaginary, because that's what he was. I mean, to figures, perhaps I don't know about within the American context. There's probably some more nuance to it, but he was a global. He was the NBA. Michael Jordan was the reason for a child in the UK or in Europe to watch the NBA. Why would you watch it?
And to buy Air Jordans, of course. That's the big one. Everybody had those basketball, boots, and it was. But what was interesting, I think, was that we've seen in this recent documentary series, The Last Dance, which has been all about that period of Jordan's career, and of course, very much a Jordan-driven, kind of produced, kind of documentary. Very, very fine documentary, actually, really interesting. But it situates that period really kind of well in a way that really it reinforces that view, Alex. Actually, that essentially, Jordan's iconic status really was needed back in the NBA. There was a real anxiety really about the fact of the kind of status of the game and ultimately whether it was going to have superstars of his magnitude again. So there was anxiety about that, and he came back, and of course the Bulls and Jordan has this second act model that once again sort of enhances him. But I have to say that what's really interesting about that was that in terms of like the Super Bowl, which had the kind of commercials between Jordan and Bugs Bunny and indeed Jordan, of course, and Larry Bird before, the Bugs Bunny Jordan combination was especially important because they wanted to reach all of America and wanted to reach all of its constituencies, from people who knew about basketball, but children. That suddenly children were going to get this this kind of link to Jordan again. If he'd gone out of the public imaginary in some way, Bugs Bunny was going to revive it. Bugs Bunny somehow was even more eternal. Jordan can maybe ebb and flow. He's peak of his game, but perhaps he'll flow away, just become this nostalgic figure. Bugs Bunny is still a superstar now. And so the whole kind of iconography and of Warner Brothers, has lasted so long that Bugs Bunny was never and is never questioned as kind of like a star in the firmament.
And I think there's a parallel there between Bugs Bunny and Michael Jordan in that, Bugs Bunny is the star of the Looney Tunes in that, if you want one figure on a poster and people think Looney Tunes, it's Bugs Bunny. But, the way the actual show pans out, it's obviously an ensemble cast. We could all have a debate about who's our favourite, who's the funniest. He's one of many. It's a team sport. But somehow Bugs Bunny has sort of been this figure of which we gravitate this cultural imaginary around to amplify Looney Tunes. In the same way, Mickey Mouse. How many people know that Mickey Mouse equals Disney, but has never seen a Mickey Mouse cartoon? Right? It's a very similar dynamic in that respect. So Jordan,
I agree,
by having that poster, Bugs Bunny and Michael Jordan, it equates the same fantastical dynamic, right? Jordan is the NBA, Bugs Bunny is cartoons. They're coming together.
And that's right, and totally deliberately so, of course. And but what I think a very interesting kind of aspect to that, though, becomes, of course, the emergence of a new character in kind of Lola Bunny, who then takes on these very dynamic characteristics for young women, watching cartoons, and later on this idea that there's this feisty, sort of very good basketball player who also kind of, sexy though she is, puts all the men in their place. Basically, puts the Monstars in their place as well. Ultimately, of course, is Bugs's kind of partner, but and they kiss at the end. But there's something actually very uncomfortable about that moment, I actually always think, because it sort of sexualizes Bugs in a way that kind of like we don't expect. We like him as a cross-dresser. We like him doing alternative things. We don't want kind of standard romance for Bugs. We want we want to play with gender. We want to play with being in drag. We want to do all sorts of things with Bugs, and certainly we want to play queer. Certainly for a queer audience, we do. The idea that he might have a conventional romance with a feisty young woman is perhaps not our preference. But either way, it was very important at the time because it established Lola as the kind of girl interest in the kind of Warner Brothers canon, and that kind of modernised so much for them about the way in which young women would invest.
I think I hadn't really thought about the iconicity. And it was the use of the word, the iconic status of Michael Jordan against Bugs Bunny as a character in this, with a degree of cultural purchase. And you're right, the sort of shoehorning of a quote-unquote conventional relationship at the end perhaps doesn't sit particularly as kind of, nicely as it should, or comfortably as it should. But I guess I was interested in what the emphasis on the real Jordan's history, his childhood, but all those kind of shots and the fact that he's obviously a person who lives in images. And I wonder as well, as part of that relationship that Alex is saying, is that what that opening or that credit sequence where my mum popped her head around and go, "Is the film started yet?" No, we're still doing a potted history of Michael Jordan. But that idea that he's a character who lives in images, and maybe the film's trying to bridge the gap between the emphasis on this real human, that he is no more or no less human, or no more or no less a person of images who is drawn, than the characters in the intergalactic amusement park or the Looney Tunes characters that he will share the court with. And so it seems like the emphasis on the real Jordan through that footage, as you said, Paul, of his last sort of his retirement between 93 and 95, that the film sort of fictionalizes that gap in between, whether or not the emphasis on the real Jordan is trying to have the inverse effect. It's trying to make him seem, through that celebrity status, as animated, as graphic, and kind of flatten him out a bit in relation to other characters.
I think there's a lot of that kind of story building, isn't there, around destiny? That kind of like there's almost a manifest destiny of Jordan's, kind of early life, and the whole idea that he's going to go to Chapel Hill, he's going to go to North Carolina, and he's going to be this successful guy and what have you. And of course, the whole idea as well, a little bit like OJ was for a long time, that somehow Jordan becomes acceptable to a white America, and he doesn't take on too much of an iconography that, as it were, is black black iconography. That comes later when, of course, he's with Spike Lee and sort of like and doing all the kind of ads that he did with Spike Lee, and the whole kind of black cultural identity starts to change with Jordan. But really, one of the kind of key things that's crucial about Bugs's kind of entry at that point is that the flattening, if there is a flattening, is one that says this is for the whole of America's kind of like audience. This is a palatable and acceptable kind of idea about Americanism and about a certain level of sort of masculinity, a certain level of playfulness and irony, a certain kind of as well underpinning sort of acceptance of the status of sport in America. Very, very crucial and important aspect of this is the importance of sport in American culture. And, these kind of things maybe are less pertinent in the UK, where we never make a decent football film unless England lose in the quarterfinals, and largely we make sport films that are about jokes, but jokes in a way that are poking fun at the sport and poking fun at the sports people. American stuff wouldn't want to do that. They'll have jokes, but the kind of respect for the sport and the whole respect for, sport within American culture is very potent,
So in terms of then animation, because this is a sports movie, it's a genre piece, it fits very. I mean, the mention that I made at the start towards the Mighty Ducks is sort of part playful insofar as it's very much a film that my dad would love, because it's an underdog story. It's a sort of a true story. Say true story, but it's based on that sort of underdog narrative, the idea of the return, as you said. So this is a sports movie, and crucially, basketball perhaps has allowances in a way that, and the film sets this up. Basketball is obviously very bodily in the way that golf quite clearly is not. But I guess pulling back a little bit, why do you? And this is a huge question, but I just wondered why has animation? I suppose why has animation turned to sports so regularly, and is it because of that sort of medium specificity element to animation, and also I guess why is it pleasurable for sport to engage with animation in this way? It's obviously it underpins your work that you've done on animation and sport and the relationship between both of them as material processes. But there's obviously pleasure in seeing animated sport in this way. So why have they been drawn to each other?
Well, I think you've got two aspects, sort of happening there, which are one of which just sheerly is about the meaning and pleasures of motion. And perfect motion as well. Animation, is a version of perfect motion in one way or another. And sport at its finest, when it's played out in terms of its most attractive aesthetics by the best players. There's this deep attraction to kind of motion and pattern and the way in which kind of certainly within the rules and regulations of a game, has got a kind of an order, a certain kind of order and metaphor that's easily transferable to kind of our social and cultural life in one form or another. Sport for some people is kind of an ideal metaphor for how society ought to run. It's got rules and regulations, it's got competition, and it's got conflict, and it's got drama, and it's got all of those things. But ultimately, everything plays itself out by fair means, ultimately, supposedly, in ways that kind of bring order and bring a sense of resolution to the way in which we might manage life. I mean, we all know that life is obviously just one long, chaotic, bizarre thing that we manage to coerce into some sort of habitual ways of being. But I mean, ultimately, it's a chaotic thing. Now, sport tries to say that it isn't really. It tries to manage, the idea of all of these kind of human dynamics within a close frame. People love sport to watch, that's the thing, so many people participate. Of course they do. There's a high percentage of people participate in sport, but so many more people like to watch it simply because inbuilt in it is kind of, an unscripted drama. Now, when it becomes animation, of course, you haven't got unscripted drama. You've got the very opposite. You've got totally scripted drama, controlled drama. So therefore, the aesthetics in animation are so vital to bringing either excessive gags, like you get obviously in the Warner Brothers stuff, or sometimes excessive lyricism that you get in much animation that takes, shall we say, animation very seriously in terms of that. and sees its underpinning emotional life. I mean, take Inside Out. Inside Out is a great sport movie, you know. Why? Is because hockey is at the absolute centre of the young girl's character. It's hockey that gives her her memory. It's her touchstone for pleasure, for home, for the way in which she felt happy. And without it, her life has basically gone into psychological and emotional collapse. It's an extraordinary thing, and sport can handle these metaphors, but animation can manage those metaphors aesthetically. And so the kind of combination between the two is really, really potent in terms of the fact that, you can get these meanings and emotions across. They're naturally metaphorically combined.
Hi everybody, I'm just pausing the podcast here for a moment because, I'm not really sure how to get this out really, but I guess, what I mean is...
what I'm trying to say is, we need your help!
Thanks, Bugs. Don't tell Chris, but you make for one hell of an animated partner. Anyway, yes, as Bugs said so eloquently, we do need your help. We're trying to gather a little bit of information about our listenership for a variety of reasons. We want to know what we're doing well, we want to know what we could be doing even better, and we want to get a sense of who's listening out there, because it will help us explain our activities to various parties that might help us continue to grow and expand fantasy-animation.org to provide more content and better content just for you. So, if you'd be so kind, would you mind sparing just a few moments to complete a short survey for us? You can access it via the website, fantasy-animation.org, as well as via our social media platforms on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The handle is, of course, Fananim Research, Fananim Research. You should find the link very easily on any of those platforms, and it will take you to a short Google Talk survey, which will take no more than a minute or two to fill out. Skip any question you like if you don't want to answer all of it, but we'd really appreciate you giving it a bit of time to think through some of the answers. It will really help us out. The survey will be live for the next few months, and we'd really encourage everyone to fill it out, whether this is your first episode or whether you're a die-hard fan. Please, help us out so that we can make better content for you. I mean, come on, I just pretended to have a conversation with Bugs Bunny on a show that I know full well has lots of people listening to it. I work at a university, I have students to teach. Chris isn't doing this segment, he's off being respectful somewhere, probably giving some informative lecture about Eisensteinian philosophy. But not me, I'm pretending to talk to Bugs Bunny on a microphone to you guys, and that's how much I care about this survey. Please complete it for me, for my sake, because apparently my sanity won't take it. For now, do get back to the show. I think I was trying to think through the relationship a little bit and how I could articulate it from sort of my perspective on the podcast. And the word that just kept coming up again and again was play. Because actually, what I was struck with when watching that sort of final basketball sequence, which is about, it's coming up to 40 minutes of the movie. It's a good old chunk of the thing here. It's how sort of there's a very delicate balancing act in that sequence, and there's not a lot of what I would call basketball in inverted commas actually happening on the court, because what's happening is a playful subversion of exactly those rules that you're describing, Paul, and like there's loads and loads of gags we could list of from stuff like him stretching out his arm, but even that actually perhaps isn't, that's him playing by the rules but within an animated body. But you get things like the Monstars are constantly sort of smacking the characters over, and basketball is a non-contact sport last time I checked, and breathing fire on Foghorn Leghorn to turning him to a bucket of KFC and all these kind of things, and a lot of the ways that the Looney Tunes come to score goals is through deception and trickery and sort of and madcap schemes, and not by passing the ball and being athletic. So it skirts a very interesting line, which I would describe as playful, in that it's always basketball, because it never just transcends the rules entirely. They don't run outside of the court, and they are ultimately trying to get the ball in the basket, and it looks like basketball, and it kind of seems like basketball, but it's one step away from the rules of basketball.
Yeah, no, that's the great thing about play and about sport, actually. Sport might have rules and regulations, but then it's got codes and conventions. And every professional knows them, that basically if a player gets past you in the last minute and he's going to score a goal, then you foul him, and everybody knows that that's going to happen. simply because that's against the rules, but it's a code and convention that's likely to happen. And you take one for the team, you get a yellow card, but you've just stopped them scoring, you know? So basically, the whole kind of idea within, obviously, something like Space Jam is that you use those moments of the idea of, you know, there's rules and regulations, but every bit of sequence is going to break them simply to make a joke or to give, actually, in some ways, the thread in the middle of it that Jordan is the only authentic player. He's the only person who can actually play basketball, you know? And so, he's the guy who gets the choreographies that are about his skills and about his particular talents as a basketball player. Whereas all the animated characters get to do the gags they normally do, you know, and they get the excessive violence, they get the excessive body distortions and so forth. But that's what's so great about that final sequence, is that even in order to justify, the idea that Jordan wins the game for them, he still has to become animated. And that is really what always entertained me so much, that even as someone like Jordan, whose skills are unparalleled in many ways, and who did have these extraordinary physical, powers of reach and leap and distance covering and so forth, in order to yet be a greater superstar and to authenticate his skills even further, had to be animated, had to be made excess,
But it seems like, on that note, that basketball, again, is the perfect space of play for a group of animators who are thinking about or thinking their way through the comic potential. And I guess this is one of the other things that that animation is, or that sport and animation, or the representation of sport in animation. And there are, I guess, many ways in which animation and sport do collide, but the representation of sport in animation is often played for its comedy, and the way in which rules can be subverted, not necessarily by the players that play them, but by the animation that draws them. And obviously, part of the pleasure, and my favourite gag in the whole film, is just seeing that kind of roast chicken hooked up to a drip towards the end of the film, when they're all sort of standing there and they've got like broken bones and things. But there's something obviously around that this is a court of play for the animators to be able to think through what gags on a basketball court might look like, and how they can play, as Alex is saying, within the rules. There are, I'd not really thought about that, the rules and regulations versus codes and conventions, because the film is very hot on that. It talks about you need 5 players or whatever, you need an extra player, and if you don't have your player, then the game will be forfeit. So there is jeopardy. The rules seem to create the jeopardy, the narrative jeopardy, and then the kind of codes and conventions are where the stuff, the comedy stuff of the film takes place.
Yeah, I thought what was interesting about that sequence, though, is that the rules are explained with some footage from the 1950s or early 60s. And kind of like, it's black and white, and it's very much implicitly saying, look, that's what they used to think it was. Do you know what I mean? That's not a modern nature of the game. That's what we traditionally think the rules are, And you always kind of pop back to the 50s to have those kind of moments in films, that there was some sort of agreed consensus then about the rules there, whether they were in sport or sex or kitchens or whatever they were. Post-war America had that sense of being reconstructed, and we're all on the same page. Whereas kind of a movie made in the 90s, is just going to say, yeah, don't think so, but let's kind of at least play lip service to that idea before we let all the animators, crack their jokes and, break the fourth wall and essentially kind of like play with all the kind of cinematic conventions, all the kind of Warner Brothers cartoons we kind of anticipate are going to happen.
I wonder if we could strengthen the ties even further just by bringing sort of the notion of childhood into the equation. Because again, you brought up Mighty Ducks in the intro, another film I'm intimately familiar with, and I can remember the Not Mighty Ducks. That's exactly or a lot of these. There's a lot of these sort of fantastical sports movies throughout Hollywood's history, from right back to sort of the 40s with things like Angels in the Outfield, which is sort of about sort of a heavenly baseball pitch, through to things like the Mighty Ducks, and whether they're overtly fantastical or not, the sport is fantastically represented in that it's all about using cunning and teamwork and creativity to think through the conventions. The Mighty Ducks with their flying V and their hide the puck behind someone's leg while the other person distracts them, and then all this kind of stuff that is absolutely at purchase in Space Jam, and it makes me think actually it's quite like what you do when you're a kid and you're playing sport, in that you don't play 11-11. No, with this country with soccer, football, you don't play 11-11 aside with your mates with a referee and 2 official goals. You play. You play Wally, or you play horse, or you rush goalie, or you play with the sport. You see what you can keep so that you're still nominally playing football, and you play with the rest of it. And
well, you see, that is a very particular kind of thing in my own, my own autobiography, really, my own biography rather, in the sense that I work at Loughborough University now. For the international listeners here, you might not know that Loughborough University is the world's leading sport university, and it's got an Olympic pool, and it's got international cricketers and rugby players coming down the drive, and you see them, you nod and wink, and people who work there have to be brilliant physical specimens like me. They have to go to the gym every day and just make sure that works. They also have to go in places like the Olympic pool in the staff lane. And basically, in the staff lane, you are next to Olympic swimmers who are going, zoom, 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 zoom. And you've got people like me who are standing in the corner keeping our sandwiches dry, And the whole kind of issue there is one that is absolutely the juxtaposition that I found so funny, in general, is that exactly as you just said, Alex, there is this professionalised model of sport, which is everything that you probably don't see in most sport movies, set against the idea of those who might know about sport, love sport, participate in it in a certain way, like me, who then get this kind of juxtaposed correspondence that is intrinsically funny. And I just really think that that's why so many sports movies kind of play out in the way that they do, But that's why you also become kind of interested in, like for me, my first earliest sport cartoon memory is actually something like the Hanna-Barbera explanations of hockey during the Olympics, which were done in animation, and they were explained by an animated hockey puck. And I remember them vividly as explaining a game that I didn't understand. So that it's kind of, you have these kind of moments where you go, oh yeah, I think that was where I first encountered it. But there's always this juxtaposition between kind of like the spectator who thinks they know about sport, as the brilliant pub pundit, versus the idea of people who actually play sport at the highest level, and never the twain is going to meet.
Well, actually, and as you were talking, I was thinking about what the film does in dramatising that space between the amateur and the professional, and then what it does with that, it treats it highly creatively. Of course, one of my favourite things about this film is that it fits into a very small but niche subgenre of Wayne Knight as bumbling sidekick films. So that's the first thing that the film does. But it obviously plays with the idea of the amateur and the professional, and capability, and you have Bill Murray, who surprisingly is quite good at the end, but kind of goes out on a high, and then you have Wayne Knight's character Stan, who sort of has been sitting on the bench this entire time. And then of course you have the professionals, and then the drama of the film is that this kind of group of 4 or 5 professionals has have their talent stolen by these animated characters, turning them from amateurs to professionals. So the film does a lot of creative things with that relationship between what it means to be able to sort of participate meaningfully, what it means to be a professional, what it means to be an amateur, what it means to learn and skill and talent. And it does all these things really creatively, I think.
Yeah, I think, and that's that wonderful little sequence in the middle, which I am really surprised that Charles Barkley agreed to do, where he witnesses, a set of girls of all people, playing basketball, and he's apparently ill at this point. He doesn't know that his talent's been stolen, but there's something wrong with him. He asks for a game with them, and of course they think he's Charles Barkley superstar, but without his talent, I mean, he's useless. And they ask him to go accordingly. They think he's an imposter. They dismiss him. You're not Charles Barkley. You're just a guy who's a wannabe, who looks like him. And Charles, just trails forlornly off, having been totally dismissed in this sequence. And this is a guy who's been in the American Dream Team. He's one of the greatest players in the game. I mean, difficult guy for sure, but I like him because of that. And of course, there's a running gag about him in the film anyway, because Jordan's got a dog kennel where, that basically, they're the dog's called Charles, and of course it's a dog, so it's Charles Barkley, isn't it? So, there's all of these kind of like implied kind of things going on at all points, which operate a little bit like cartoonal jokes, of course. They are the kind of jokes you would see in a Warner Brothers cartoon. So those tensions, I think, are played out. Actually, the more I think about the film, it's got a lot going for it in terms of its self-conscious kind of address of the tensions between sport and animation, really, and how it uses them effectively to play out a certain kind of ironic take on things.
And I guess talent versus creativity, right? And that that's always in flux in the movie, in that half of the movie is about valorizing Michael Jordan's innate talent, right back from that sort of destiny sequence right at the beginning, and then the other half is Monstars. All they have is talent. They don't have an affiliation with the sport. They don't have a love of the sport. They don't really know what basketball is. But they suck the talent out of these superstars, and therefore they're playing good basketball, but there's a sense that they're not playing fair basketball, and that's kind of this sort of machine-like, let's win the game because that will please our boss back in space, is not how basketball should be played. And Bugs Bunny is playing it better, because although he's not as good as basketball as the Monstars, he's playing it with a love and creativity behind him. There's I'm not sure it reconciles it, but it certainly kind of throws the hornet's nest of those tensions around for a bit.
Now I'm going to throw this in there because I don't have an answer to this. Actually, I'm interested in what you both think, and I was going to talk about race, and I was talking about the distinction that the film makes between Michael Jordan's body and the bodies of its kind of, I guess, the two white characters, so Wayne Knight and Bill Murray, and a couple of other characters that when those characters are first introduced, Bill Murray in particular, he's playing golf, and golf is obviously, as I said, very different to basketball, but I'm just trying to get my head around what the film is doing with kind of exceptionalism and the relationship between exceptionalism and race, and actually it was when you were talking about the Charles Barkley sequence when he goes to visit a group of young diverse children, and he has that confrontation with that young black girl who sort of defeats him and then says that you aren't the real Charles Barkley. And I don't really know what to say about that and what the film is doing with the exceptionalism of Jordan's black body versus the kind of, I suppose, the more problematic version of that, which is his body should be celebrated, or blackness is something that should be celebrated only when it is exceptional. And I'm just trying to get my head around what the film, if it does have anything to say about race in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about that is kind of like it's always interesting with films like that about the role they play within the text of the film. And then, of course, the extra text that they always carry with them in terms of their, identities outside film. And this film really does problematize that very, very significantly. I think one of the kind of interesting things about the kind of racial, aspect of that is in that first golfing sequence. I think it's very important that Larry Bird is there. Larry Bird, obviously, again, a highly exceptional, basketball player, and was and for a long time was seen as perhaps, someone who could be seen as good as Jordan, or might be seen as the top player in the American game. So he had a considerable status, and of course he'd participated in a number of advertisements with Jordan. They came as a bit of a comic couple in various commercials. But they were very much given a kind of what we might call race equivalence. Let's not look at race here. These are two superstar sportsmen who basically represent a kind of, shall we say, I don't know, the kind of America that says, let's not look at race issues in a negative light. Very much, as I say, a little bit like OJ for a long time. OJ was very much a champion of white culture and explicitly said that basically he didn't want to be, in a certain sense, a race symbol. He wanted to just be a top quality sportsman, and again pass into the media industries without, his blackness being kind of like a definitive symbolic, aspect of his persona, of his celebrity. And I think Jordan was a little bit like that as well. It was certainly, I think, Spike Lee who politicized him much more. But Jordan really still stayed pretty distant from that because he had too much of an eye on commerce. He had to sell training shoes, and that means he's got to go to black and white America acceptably. Now Barkley, really, is an important piece of casting because he had no interest in that. He was a superstar player, but he explicitly said, "I'm not a symbol to you. I don't bring up your children. I don't want to be a role model. And however I behave outside the court is my business." And we've seen that in American sport across the board with, sort of NFL players, for example, who've said the same thing. Look, I'm an American football player, but that's my identity. What I do outside the sport is my business, But then, of course, you have comeuppance in that with people like Michael Vick. I don't know whether you know him, one of the great NFL, quarterbacks who anticipates the kind of Mahomes and the people of today. But at one point, he got caught for the fact that he was running dogfighting. And in his culture and from the place that he came from, that was a kind of naturalized kind of like aspect of that cultural life. And of course, it was seen, of course, quite rightly by animal welfare people and so forth as illegal. And he was sent to jail. And there was all sorts of things of that sort. He makes the kind of recovery later on by coming back and being successful, then becoming a great pundit, learning his lesson. But these kind of trajectories of kind of like rise and fall and second act and kind of the whole sense of which sporting, kind of culture, talent can transcend somehow, sort of a particular kind of moral code or ultimately prove it, really kind of happens a lot in sport. And I think all of that has definitely characterized what we might call, issues of race, issues of gender, issues of sexuality in sports films.
Just only to add to that, I think, because I agree with all of it, is that I think what's interesting about the movie is that I think on the one hand, the explicit narrative is very keen to place Jordan in white spaces. Certainly, sort of the live action stuff. He's constantly surrounded by sort of white figures of familial figures, Wayne Knight, Bill Murray, these sort of white stars, and whilst his rivals in the NBA are not, they inhabit black spaces, right? The Barkley scene is very particular in that sort of coding. And then you've got the Monstars, who are partially as a sort of narrative device that they're meant to sort of embody the physical attributes of those they've stolen the talent from, but the people they've stolen the talent from are all black superstars, and they are very coded as black in the film. So on one level, it's doing something pretty problematic, and I think it's a contradictory text because most texts are. But I think the one thing I will say, sort of in terms of grounding the audience in black spaces and in black culture, is the soundtrack. Adds hip hop to the equation, and the relationship between hip hop and basketball is really important to emphasize. And the way that the soundtrack kind of very subtly, perhaps too subtly, does highlight. I mean, it's a very sanctified version of sort of mid-90s hip hop. It's a very child-friendly version. We get the R. Kelly, "I Believe I Can Fly" here, and you get these sort of songs about the cartoon people and the song, the title song about Space Jam. But it is at least drawing on a sort of urban black musical vernacular to sell. And I can attest that Space Jam was the first album I ever bought as a child, which speaks terribly or wonderfully to me. I don't know which, but I remember how important that album was to the whole cultural obsession of the movie, because the album was everything, and the song "I Believe I Can Fly" was school disco fodder. It was massive.
Yeah, on that issue of, you said the kind of race currency or the racial currency, I was thinking about the values that the film allocates to white characters largely, the Wayne Knights and the Bill Murrays of the film, and how that plays, how the film treats the idea of expertise, whether or not it's something. Certainly, I think that sort of pre-credit sequence where we see a young Michael Jordan, there's something about talent that is innate, that obviously has a long history when it is mapped onto the body politics of black bodies, and that there's something innate and powerful in a way that doesn't map onto white bodies. White skill comes from another place. It comes from kind of learning and talent and intellect in a way there's something more bodily and more physical. And so I wonder what that then does to the cartoon characters, and what sort of racial body politics is going on with them, because they are I don't know, they pass but they don't, and I'm just trying to get my head around the
I mean, obviously, I mean, this it's kind of, it really takes me back, that particular question, to the moment when I started to write about, or wanted to write anyway, about animation and animals, and I just thought, there'd be a massive literature about that, massive, and of course there was none. I was absolutely stunned, and so kind of ended up writing Animated Bestiary, kind of like as a way of starting a lot more of that absolutely necessary discourse, because if you've got a form like animation, which across virtually 100 years has largely used animals as its central characters, and not only in American cartoons but all over the world, you just say, well, what function, of course, does animal characters play? And one of the functions they play, like all as it were, non-human characters, is that the politics that they carry can be either obscured or blurred, or in a certain way not attached explicitly to a human being. So the monsters, in being monstrous in a certain way, they might carry the talents of black and white NBA players, but they kind of cancel out almost the idea of the kind of racial, readings of some of those things. And of course, and such is the way of animation across the board, that all sorts of kind of gender identities, race identities, all sorts of social identities can in some way be elided, or they can be blurred. And of course, that very much invited in the moment of queer politics, because queer politics could say, well, look, animation best represents the performance of identity and the performance of the way in which we might address particular discourses of identity politics. Now, that tension between when they're blurred and we can't actually figure them out at all, so they kind of obscure the event, versus kind of overt metaphors about race, gender, and identity, have characterized a lot of animation and animation sport, work for any amount of years, because, of course, they're going to carry discourses that you might not be able to explicitly say in other forms.
I was thinking about then on that note, this sort of, Alex mentioned at the start the sort of registers of fantasy, and I was what I find interesting about the film is that, well, one, you have Porky Pig enter into the world of Wile E. Coyote, which for a minute, because you have characters in the film watching cartoons, so they have a kind of cultural currency within the world of the film. Then that's problematized by the fact that you can actually go and visit seemingly the world that we've seen in the cartoons. You just have to drill into the center of the earth, go through the sort of familiar Warner Brothers series of circles, and then we're into the world. And I was trying to think, and this is kind of going back to what Alex was talking about earlier with regards to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and I know Alex has feelings about Who Framed Roger Rabbit insofar as, and we talk often a lot about the oil and water relationship between animation and live action, is that the tendency is to think of them as connected and sharing the same court, but of course part of the pleasure is that full well that these people couldn't possibly interact with Michael Jordan, that yet there's the pleasure of always maintaining that dissonance and knowing that these are a function of the special powers of the medium, and not that they actually might have passed the basketball to each other. And so I was trying to think about all the different registers of fantasy and the way that the film organises its characters, stars in one world can pass to another world. Is this the same as something like Who Framed Roger Rabbit? What I was interested in is that you have, from the perspective of the cartoon characters, they call the live action world is the other world, because they call it 3D land. And I really like that inversion of films that set up our world as the main one and then go into these toon worlds, whereas it's the other way around. What's strange is our world, and actually most of the film takes place not in our world but in the world of the cartoons.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, it's a very important observation in relation to the nature of how we, in a sense, how we construct worlds. One of the kind of big things about the Warner Brothers landscape, for example, is one very much, I think, that has got a very clear there's a kind of clear picture in the public imagination, certainly in American animation, American imaginary. About sort of like the Warner Brothers kind of visual space, and sort of and Disney, for my money, has that far more related to the theme parks and the whole kind of way in which kind of like Main Street Missouri works, and how Disney's created a kind of 3D theme park version of that. But the Warner Brothers kind of model is very much that sort of way in which its world is almost immediately visible, and there's much of me that says that it's got a coherence as a world for all of its zaniness and for all of its kind of chaos that actually the American public are really, really familiar with. So they would recognise the differentials between the idea of old school cartoons of the 30s and 40s particularly, but actually into the 50s too, and the way in which we construct American urban or suburban life. They're almost distinct worlds in that way anyway. So there's a way in which, like Jordan in this, obviously, that there's a moment where he goes home and he's got this family life, obviously, and the 3 children, and it's a kind of supposedly kind of typical American home that that presents him ironically in a moment of failure. I mean, the whole the way that baseball is treated in it, I think is hilarious because it's that sense of kind of like, you suck, you really can't play baseball. You're a basketball player, And of course, that's partly how he's goaded into actually playing the sort of match, both in relation to, the kind of, both at the end with the NBA players, even in terms of a kind of, play between them, that somehow that he can't take the idea that he, can be criticised or he can be, seen as a failure in some way. And of course, Last Dance really does confirm that. If you watch that series, quite extraordinary, the kind of lengths that Jordan would go to not fail, and that would include, really obliterating others around him, both in the team and in opposition, make sure that his particular identity was maintained. So some quite complex stuff going on in there, in those ways. But I think that's sort of how it starts to function, that the worlds are already identifiable almost historically. We've seen those cartoons so often that even by the time we get to the 90s and certainly now, those worlds are as distinctive as anything you can name in the kind of material world of American life. Yeah,
absolutely. The baseball thing I think is interesting because it sort of puts his black body in a different space, and that's almost a shorthand into where he doesn't quite fit in that world. He's not very good. I think the comparison between baseball and basketball in the film is interesting. But actually, I was gonna. This film, I don't think, it wouldn't work if it was a version of Mickey's polo match or something. It has to be, it has to be Looney Tunes. And so I was going to ask you, Paul, it has to be Looney Tunes for the way that the film wants to construct its particular brand of animated anarchy. It seems like it's got. Of course, it's the Looney Tunes characters that, as you said, inhabit a world that is coherent and familiar to us historically, in a way that it wouldn't quite work. It would be a different film if it was Disney characters.
And there's there's some very clear evidence to that, actually, because if you go back to the goofy sport cartoons, really, absolutely explicitly from 1941 to 1951 or two, essentially. The whole kind of idea about Goofy's place in them is kind of to explain the rules of various sports, and you make lots of gags about the fact that he can't execute and that he kind of that he'll mess up putting on a pair of skis, or he'll not be able to play basketball and twist himself into a knot or something like that. And they're all kind of bona fide, brilliantly animated Disney gags. But it's really funny because those films were made in response to Warner Brothers' kind of already redefinition of the cartoon, because Warner Brothers had sped it up. Warner Brothers had kind of made it more urban and more anarchic. The jokes were, obviously a little more adult sometimes. But Disney responded by saying, the best way to respond to that is to make even faster animation. So basically, the Disney animators do all these incredible sequences, actually, over that period in terms of sports choreography played out through Goofy as a character. But ultimately, by the time they get to the last film, in kind of that cycle of Goofy's, sports films, they're essentially aping Warner Brothers cartoons. They almost admit that it's lost. They're all fragmented. They're all kind of balmy gags. There's a cartoon that's got even a sequence that's jumped in from Pinocchio. and so they kind of fragment the cartoon in a very Warner Brothers way, because they realise the choreographies of animation, even done as brilliantly as they are by the Disney crowd, can't quite have that currency of a Warner Brothers kind of ironic, slick, urban, today modern feel.
And just to sort of, I guess, my 2 cents on the whole versions of rhetoric going on and how it feeds into that kind of Warner Brothers stable is that it's just the key word of anarchy that transcends through all these things. And I've just 2 points I've got to say, which is, one is about Moron Mountain, which I think is a really interesting plot device, because that doesn't need to be in this film, right? We don't need to introduce we don't need to introduce a new aspect. That we've already got to try and buy into the idea that Bugs Bunny's going to play basketball with Michael Jordan. Now we've also got to buy into the fact that there's these aliens from outer space that are the villains of the movie who we've never met before. But I think what that does is that actually what it could read like is very much a Who Framed Roger Rabbit Toontown kind of scenario, where the animated centre of the earth is where toons live, and then everything else is live action. But by having that out of space rupture, that's all suddenly in flux, and really the language is a world we know and a world that is intrusive, and the intrusive is animated and the world we know is live action, because the aliens come down from outer space, and then there's the shot, right, where Michael Jordan watches the alien spaceship come down from outer space and then immediately go straight past 3D land and bound into the center of the earth. And it's like, we're going to bypass reality and go from one fantasy to another, and that's sort of how the film is playing things out. And then my second point is the difference in the film between Wayne Knight and Bill Murray, in that I'm pretty sure, other than the Monstars, Wayne Knight is the only character in this film who isn't a pre-established Looney Tunes figure who we already know. So arguably Bugs Bunny is playing himself in the movie, and isn't someone else playing themselves. Poor Wayne Knight, when he must have got the gig, because he's the only person who has to play a character, in the sense that Bill Murray gets to play Bill Murray, all the NBA stars get to play the NBA stars, but Wayne Knight plays is it Stan something, isn't it? He's like a snivelling kind of PR figure, and that kind of disturbs the whole thing, because then you've got Bill Murray everyone's playing themselves except Wayne Knight, who's enough of a celebrity, at least in my head, to know who that's Wayne Knight. That's an actor, a famous actor, and yet that's in flux too. So the whole thing's in flux and anarchic.
What was fascinating at this stage is we've not even mentioned Danny DeVito.
Of course,
Danny DeVito is the big kind of vocal, artist, comedian who is in this film, but he really, obviously he voices Swackhammer, the big villain, up in Moron Mountain. The guy who's watching Rabbit of Seville, and watching, Warner Brothers cartoons, and sees them as attractions. For those, I thought, it's a gift, that one, for film studies, people, when he says what we need is attractions, and he immediately says what we need is these guys.
It's also a gift for us, making the Disney Warner Brothers comparison, that the villains of the piece are a theme park constantly looking for new attractions, right? I mean, I had to get that in there.
And equally, the whole kind of thing about what the space element, of course, is really to reference all of that kind of, Marvin the Martian, kind of like, sort of late Warner Brothers cartoons that were really popular in the States, the kind of, as well as the kind of sort of Grand Canyon type deserts of the Roadrunner. The Warner Brothers became as popular for, in a certain sense, their implied space operas, that they were kind of playing back again to the kind of, the Star Wars crowd and the space elements of it, the Jetsons and the like, So all of these kind of like, sort of narratives that got purchased in American cultural life, the film was really self-conscious about, and readily used. And I think that it's kind of it's that knowingness that, in a certain sense, still makes this film watchable. When you go back to a lot of films from, certainly I feel, the 80s and 90s now, and I'm thinking, God, just how appalling is that? But there's still a kind of currency around Space Jam that, because of its knowingness, and I'll be very surprised if the new LeBron, movie has got that level of kind of knowingness in it about, not merely kind of like cartoon history, but American cultural history, and the kind of ways in which audiences have interacted with the idea of obviously of Jordan's career, but Bugs Bunny's career, of the kind of the Warner Brothers, Saturday morning cartoon kind of identity, and how that related then, to what was then Hanna-Barbera, basically being, cartoons shown on a Saturday morning. So, Warner Brothers was always remembered much more because, of course, they were full animation and they were kind of so different from the reduced animation of Hanna-Barbera that in the popular American memory, those old cartoons stood up. They were so much better, as it were. So all of those factors come into this, and I think Space Jam, is a nice compendium of all of these kind of issues, as you were pointing out at the beginning of our conversation, because for anybody who's interested in animation, sport, American cultural history, and so forth, it's a nice touchstone to any amount of debates and issues there.
Yeah. Well, actually, you, about this kind of currency that they still... Obviously, they hold this currency, as I said, in the film, because characters sit down and watch, and Michael Jordan puts on the cartoons for his children as a way of sort of... And actually, it's because of the disruption to the cartoon that we know something is up. We're running... I mean, we could keep going, but I mean, I'm interested in the 90s-ness of it. And this works very well with the film Flubber, which came out the year after, which I also think has a basket. It was based around the impact of animation and a form of animation on sport and the ability of anyway. But I guess Alex made a point at the start about nostalgia, and I just wondered where this sort of... Because what I like about... I knew not much about this film beyond... the characters, obviously, and its sort of importance within a sort of American, as you say, cultural history, but also the fact that the website had always been the 1996 version of the website. If you visit Space Jam website, it looks like the 96 version of the site, as if there's something that's happening around what the film is doing with pastness and nostalgia, and how that then feeds into what it then does with Michael Jordan. And so, yeah, I just wondered the nostalgic element for us as we sit here X amount of years after that film and anticipating the new one. Yeah, that whether that knowingness comes from something that's nostalgic, because I think, Alex, you mentioned at the start something around what interests you about the film is around nostalgia.
Well, I think I've declared numerous times how I perhaps have a nostalgic relationship to the film, but I think also the film is nostalgic for the 50s, 60s cartoons of which it's referencing. And I think what's interesting is, of course, we've got... I haven't looked into the credits of this, Paul, but obviously this isn't... As you made the point, Paul, the labour behind Bugs Bunny doesn't exist anymore. At least it's transferred to a completely new labour department. We've got a new set of animators. We've got a new voice cast. None of the mechanics, the bits of Bugs Bunny exist in the real world anymore. And yet what we get is Bugs Bunny on screen. So I think a lot of what we've already said about sort of making these things into icons and timeless icons that can exist as objects of fantasy. Part of what it's doing is, yes, it's kind of reclaiming Michael Jordan's fantastical nature, but it's also saying, don't worry, Bugs Bunny is still there. He's just underground and we can't see him quite so often. And it's all right if he doesn't quite sound the same, but he is the same, you know. Yeah.
That's the thing, though. That's the whole thing, is that he can, like many characters of that sort, they can be just absolutely. Well, I suppose, Chris, it's some of the stuff that you said about hybridity before. These hybridities tend to be about their original identities as they emerged as iconic cartoon characters, matched with their newer capacity to be a cipher for the contemporary moment. And so kind of like Bugs in the 90s there would have been seen to be a combination of his 40s identity, but in the midst of it, the kind of idea of the ironic kind of take on 90s culture. And so is a suitable character for that. It fits. But nevertheless, there's a cipher of 90s-ness there. So it'd be quite interesting, in July when the new movie comes out, to see where, Bugs' iconography will be drawn upon, this means war. There's going to be that, and there's going to be, left turns at Albuquerque, and we're going to get all of that kind of stuff happening. But we're also going to get that cipher of what does he represent now, in 2021, up against and working with LeBron, who is a much more kind of edgier, complex, egocentric, sort of guy who has always championed himself as someone who is better than Jordan. So that's a really kind of interesting kind of thing there to see how that will play out. But whatever way, I think that nostalgic thing is almost just built in to our understanding of sadly, actually, and it was very detrimental for a long time, of animation in general. It was positioned as a childhood thing, a children's thing, and it took a long time to really get that out of the equation, to say that it's not only that. That's the first thing. We can look at any amount of things that aren't that. And then in order to then reposition it to say, if it is part of childhood and if it is kind of children's entertainment, then what is it doing specifically? What is it doing, in terms of the way in which we remember it? And so much of that will be, the particular moments in which we've seen certain cartoons at a certain age. All that crowd that that kind of really champions Transformers as a cartoon, for example. It was their moment of childhood, and no one's going to say that Transformers are rubbish, and so forth. And for me, the irony of it is, of course, I'm old enough to really still be in that late Watch with Mother generation that was still kind of Mr. Ben and Mary Mungo and Midge, and actually Czechoslovakian cartoons, or what were Czechoslovakian cartoons. Didn't know that at the time, but they were these weird things that came on Wednesday afternoons. So my kind of nostalgic recollections are less about those things, but certainly for an American public, they would absolutely be rooted in the idea that they were part of virtually every childhood to this day. So we're going to have that long into the future too.
Yeah. I feel we should wrap up. What a treat! We'll have to get you back for when the new film comes out for sure, and see what it's doing in relation to the original. We've covered so much. I just wonder if there's any sort of final bits that we haven't touched on. I think the voice is really interesting. There was something that didn't quite sit right in terms of some of the voices, and though it wasn't as much of a distraction as I perhaps thought, but I was very interested in what the film was doing with its voice cast and some of the key players that have a tradition in terms of voice artistry. Billy West, Maureen LaMarche, all these kinds of figures that are really important to actually the extra textual iterations of these characters across different media platforms, when we don't have the original and we have impersonations that appear across different video games or television series.
I suppose part of it is when we as an audience are explicitly asked to recognise a voice for particular purposes, and in that particular moment, it was very important that people recognised that Danny DeVito was in it, even though you'd never ever see it, So Swackhammer is sort of DeVito-esque in the design. We know that there's a kind of DeVito-esque kind of attitude that follows with that. So his star persona kind of flows into the film in a particular way. It's very important, for example, that we know that Woody is Tom Hanks. That is a very important, sort of relationship. But if you think about any amount of other animated characters, even if they've got stars playing them, there's often a desire to really downplay that aspect on the basis of, the idea is go with the character, not with the star persona. And I think there's some real tensions there across the board when we kind of recognise key players in terms of their stardom as they impact upon their characters. And then when you've got a situation, Chris, as you've just pointed out, where if we're used to that as the vocal delivery, how it changes when somebody else is doing that. As recently with things like Buzz Lightyear, for example, in the cartoons and the like, no, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
Now, does that disturb or change your interpretation of the character? And it may well do, of course. So sound in general is crucial in animation for any amount of reasons, but that vocal intonation might make all the difference about whether we believe these imaginaries or whether in fact we abandon them.
Well, I suppose it goes back to the thing that we began with, then the poster of the film that has Michael Jordan and Bugs Bunny, and the way in which we were invited to respond to who Bugs is in the film in relation, and this idea of him being a cipher for particular historical cultural moments, but also we're supposed to understand him as is equal to or in the same bodily terms or the same starry terms as somebody like Michael Jordan and the cultural associations that come with both of those characters, and then what happens when you put them in a film together.
Yeah, Chris, I think it's actually turns out to be the very opposite. It's actually, in fact, Bugs is the bigger star.
Yeah.
And so the association for Jordan with Bugs is far more important.
Yeah.
And crucially because He's cross age, he's cross gender, he's cross history. He will be more well known to an American public, than Jordan. Jordan will, of course, be known to millions, but there will be a major sector of American cultural life who are not interested in sport, don't engage with sport, that may know him only, in passing. And just a reference to that, which I always come across in teaching, is when, for example, I ask predominantly white middle class students who Sachin Tendulkar is, the cricketer, and sort of like, of course, he is God across Asia, and hardly anybody in the room knows him, and so these cultural factors, these national factors, and historical factors really are so fundamental to our identities. And that's why iconic characters from animation like Mickey Mouse, like Bugs Bunny, in being kind of eternal, are the ones that people will recognise far more probably than people who come and go, so to speak.
Well, I suppose with the sport thing, we have sportsmen have when they come to what can be a relatively short career, that can also be cut short at various moments. They go into management or punditry, or they sort of disappear. And I love that idea that the eternal nature of Bugs once again speaks to animation legitimizing live action again.
Yeah. Well, for us animation champions, I mean, all of that always kind of like makes you feel that it's the justification you can make when people turn around and say, "Oh, that's just for kids." And that's less of an accusation about animation nowadays. But nevertheless, there's always a strong sense in which once you start getting people to watch animation for the kind of language of expression that it is, you'd be hard pushed for most people not to go, "Wow, hang on, I've never seen it like this before." And once they start seeing it, you can't unsee it. You do see what animation kind of can offer to storytelling, to representation, to the ways in which we construct motion and construct our universe in general. That that is obviously very different from the kind of physical worlds of material life.
I think increasingly, just for kids, from my perspective, I don't mind that animation is for kids. I think it is culturally often consumed by children, and I think you put it well earlier in the podcast, Paul, when you said that it's not necessarily about shutting that down; it's about exploring it in some depth. So I think the problem with the sentence is the word "just," because it simplifies and it excludes, and it doesn't, and it shouldn't do either. So I think hopefully we have removed the word "just" from Space Jam in our conversations.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, again, culturally, it's very different. I work regularly, across Europe with screenwriters who are doing, features for children and television programs for children. And there's no cultural issues about that whatsoever in, France, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium. It's seen as an art form, and an art form that can culturally reach children in an accessible way, but in ways that bring them, everything from entertainment to education, without anybody even vaguely saying that it's just anything, So, I've always thought that, and I suppose again, this is something that I like to remind virtually everybody that that over the years, and for the animation cognoscenti, they know this, but in sort of more public audiences, I've had to remind them all that the history of the American animated cartoon is not the history of animation, and that animation has got a long history all over the world and in all sorts of different kind of contexts and places and forms. And if we keep that in mind, inevitably we're going to see the American version of things as only one version, and that's actually quite helpful.
Chris, we've got a lot more episodes to record, it sounds like.
Yes. Now, normally this is the bit in the podcast where Alex does the. Obviously we'll say a proper thanks, but what I wanted to do is actually talk about your Twitter handle, because this is normally the place where Alex would say, so where can people find you and find your work, and anyone, I think anyone who's interested in animation will probably own a copy of your 1998 book, Understanding Animation, and most libraries will stock it. So Alex is nodding at me. But they can obviously find you on social media. So I was gonna, what's your Twitter? Because I think this actually feeds quite nicely into this collision of animation and sport.
Yeah, I mean, for me, kind of like I didn't really get into social media for any amount of reasons, simply because I'm very fortunate that I get contacted and connected with by people from all sorts of walks of life from all over the world all the time for various kind of connections and so forth. But I actually did create a Twitter handle called @BeautifulFrame, which was basically just at beautiful_frame, one should say, which was related to the exhibition that I did first at the National Football Museum 2017 about animation and sport. It's 200 films, 80 artifacts from all over the world, sort of celebrating sport, but within the context of the National Football Museum. Yeah. It went and toured a bit in Japan and it's gone to China, but hopefully going to eventually get to Australia and so forth. They're very interested in taking it there. But the whole idea was to kind of why the National Football Museum were very interested was that the idea that they wanted to stretch their audience in two ways. One, in terms of sport, because it was more than football, so to speak, but also in terms of animation. They had no aspect of the museum at all that was animated. Nothing. Not one single element. And when I actually said, because I went there one day with my son and my partner and just basically said, hey, look, we could do a big exhibition in here. And my son said, you're going to do a big exhibition in here, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. And away we went, So there it was. But it was very important because I wanted, the representation of sport, obviously to be in an exhibition of that sort and in a museum of that sort. But crucially, that actually animation has as much to say about sport or indeed anything else as any other discipline, And they love, for example, a lot of films that I showed about fans. There's a whole lot of animated films about sports fans, and and that was a big thing that we did an outreach event about and everything else. And people loved those films. They thought that they had embraced sport and the relationship to human emotion much more powerfully than virtually any other sport film they'd seen. So it was really a kind of, a good thing to do.
Wonderful. So that's, beautiful, @beautiful_frame for those Twitter folks. Alex, I'm going to leave the rest of the mopping up to you as you do it better than me every week.
That's very kind. Oh, is that kind? Yeah, all right, fine. I get the admin jobs. Paul, I mean, this isn't admin at all. This is supreme gratitude. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast and for chatting to us about Space Jam. It's been an absolute pleasure, as I thought it was going to be, but you have confirmed so much.
I know you're very, very welcome, and I'm obviously very happy to natter animation about anything, anytime, whenever you'd like to. So it's all good fun. But thank you very much for inviting me. It was a very good conversation though, because we did manage to cover all the kind of touchstones of that film. I think hopefully in a way that it's just not about Space Jam, but as about animation, about sport, and a range of other topics that people might be interested in. Yeah. So thanks very much. It's been terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And you can find us at fantasy-animation.org. Why not read our previous blog posts? We've got lots of stuff covering many of the issues we've discussed on this show. We've got an episode, I think, where we talked about Paul's book when we did Bread Knobs and Broomsticks, and we talked about the football match in that. So why not access our archive there? And you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Reddit @FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. If you're feeling very old-fashioned, you can also use that handle and put an @gmail.com and send us an email. Let us know what you thought of the show and any feedback, any sports movies and we should be checking out in the future. Otherwise, thanks very much for joining us for another week and we'll see you next time.
Bye.